Okay, everybody, if we could begin. I'd like to thank you all today for attending our panel, Algorithms, or How Content Finds You. Before we begin, we have a short video. And so if we can just dim the lights in this comfortable auditorium, we can transition to the movie.
We live in a world of choice. Content is available everywhere on so many
En
platforms.
cette ère numérique, nous sommes submergés de contenus sur diverses plateformes.
Being able to find this content is a challenge, not just here, but around the
Le
world.
défi est de trouver le contenu dans un environnement numérique en constante
And more often
évolution.
than not, they're doing it through access
Les
versus
utilisateurs
ownership.
sont maintenant plus rapides que la
Users
télé.
are now faster than TV. The age of abundance turned our world upside down.
Comment en sommes-nous arrivés là?
How did we get here? The post-TV era is made of disruption,
Et d'innovation.
millennials are commanding change in the digital space.
Force le changement dans l'espace numérique.
What can analytics tell creators in the digital era?
Trouvez votre contenu
Find your content
ou laissez-le vous trouver.
or let it find you.
Le futur est maintenant.
Future is now. And now, how do we move from discoverability to discovered?
Okay, welcome everyone to our panel on Algorithms or How Content Discovers You. I'm the moderator for this panel. My name is Fenwick McKelvey. I'm an assistant professor at Concordia University in the Communication Studies Department, where I study quite broadly information and communication technology policy. I'm joined by three very esteemed panelists. I'm very happy to be able to be in conversation with them today. On my immediate left is Christopher Berry, Senior Manager in Product Intelligence at CBC. And to benefit Canadians, his team turns data into product and enables others to do so. Previously, he co-founded Authentic.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm very bad at pronunciation. So, a social authentication analytics company, developed product at Synapsys, and co-founded the marketing science department at the digital agency Critical Mass. Next, we have Daniel Lemire, who is a computer science professor at the University of Quebec, and he has a BSc, an MSc, and a PhD in engineering mathematics at the École Polytechnique de the Université de Montréal. He has written over 45 peer-reviewed publications, including 25 journals. He's held several competitive research grants, and he's been an invited expert to appear on many panels, including for the NSERC and the FQRNT. His open source software has been used by major corporations such as Google and Facebook. His research interests include databases, information retrieval, and high performance computing. Clearly, someone else who has much expertise to bring to this conversation. And then finally, we have Dylan Ribling. Ribling, Yeah, I was always going to do that. Is a filmmaker and who lives and works in Toronto. He works across several genres, from documentary to drama. His documentary work focuses on science, technology, and investigative work. And his most recent film, Looking for Mike, just recently was premiered on CBC. Yeah. Led to the solving of a 23-year-old missing persons case. In his spare time, Dylan works in interactive art using digital projecting technologies to explore cinematic forms in non-cinematic contexts. So I'd like to join me in welcoming our panelists. And I'll begin our conversation broadly speaking, about this kind of relationship between algorithms and discoverability. And for those who've read the CMF report, they'll know that it's one important lever, industrial lever, influencing how content is discovered by Canadians. Now, it's an interesting time for this panel on algorithms because we've recently discovered that in the United States, the recent Facebook controversy, the news trending team has suddenly told us that algorithms aren't really important and that it's humans really that we should be paying attention to. So with that, I think we can adjourn our panel and we'll leave it at that. The truth of it is, I felt like this was a great beginning to our conversation because it encourages us to be kind of specific about that influence of algorithms and what particularly are they doing, and trying to understand how humans and algorithms relate, both in terms of teams working to design what's trending, while also simultaneously how humans and publics interact with these algorithms. And so I felt like we could kick it off by just beginning by trying to qualify what particularly is the role of algorithms in an age of discoverability. And when we were prepping a little bit, Dylan, you mentioned the story of the kind of the difference between Netflix and Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could begin, because I thought that might be a good introduction to some of these themes here.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit more context, I'm a filmmaker, so I work within the cultural industry. So I've got I wear that hat, but I'm also, for the past year, I've been developing this project with the NFB, an interactive documentary about algorithms. So I've been doing lots of deep diving into literature and talking to people about algorithms, and I'm sort of examining it from sort of the ethics of algorithms, and trying to get the flavor, trying to get the soul of the machine. And one of the things that really stuck out while I was prepping for this panel was someone sort of, the challenge is, how do you describe an algorithm? Because it's like a series of mathematical steps or procedural steps. And someone likened recommendation engines. They sort of talked about, I think it was Pedro Dominguez from the Master Algorithm, sort of talked about the difference between the Amazon algorithm for recommendation, which, if you think about it like a bookstore, Amazon is, they want to welcome you into the store and then show you the best sellers. And hey, you like that book? Well, here, let me show you the second shelf. And they want to show you, they want to upfront all the new titles, all the popular titles. Whereas Netflix, their system is a lot different. They've got their big flashy titles at the storefront, and they welcome you into the store. But how their model works is it's more like, hey, come check out like our big flashy titles up front, and then hey, while you're here, come on and check out. We've got these old weird books in the back. I think I've got just the right book for you. So when talking about algorithms, there are a lot of different approaches, and it's not just one size fits all. They each have their own flavor, and I think that has a big impact on the kinds of content that we're going to be receiving, taking in the future.
Daniel, one of the pieces, before the panel I tweeted one of the pieces that Daniel wrote kind of as an introduction to some of these themes, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I really encourage it. But you also picked up on some of the ways that Amazon works, and so I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the kind of Amazon algorithm and its kind of relationship to collaborative filtering.
Right, so you describe recommender systems as being procedural, so the idea is that there's a clear logic, but that's not, I think you could describe it a little bit differently. So when Amazon came up with its famous recommender system, where it says, if you like this book, you're going to like these books, right? So this was patented in 1998 by Greg Linden and others. And how it works is essentially the algorithm itself is fairly easy to understand, but it's eating a lot of data about our behavior. So it's more like statistics, really, than algorithms. So really, we call this panel a panel about algorithms, but it could be called, a statistics panel too. And it's a lot harder then to understand what's going on, because you've got a massive amount of data to cipher through. And if you don't have this data and you just look at the algorithm, you cannot predict what it's going to do.
And in fact, in a 2009 paper on Amazon, a marketing scientist looked at how people were using those recommendations and how people were actually training that algorithm. It turns out that one of the biggest factors in terms of buying a recommended book was trying to find a price point that brought you just slightly over the free shipping limit. So you ended up getting this fascinating, the author called it a fishnet effect, where aggregate human behavior was actually shaping the statistics and shaping which books were actually going to be seen and presented. So it's a two-way street, that there's the intent of the data scientists and the computer scientists in constructing the algorithm, and then there's what all of you folks do to them. We've seen some pretty horrible things that you've done in aggregate. We've also seen some beautiful things that you've done in aggregate.
And I mean, it's interesting because in response to some of these, trying to think about the term algorithm itself is one that we kind of, lo and behold, it's become a popular phrase that, but captures, I think, a dynamic that we might talk about as more interactive media in a sense. In that, first, that we do have people making decisions and generating large amounts of data, and that data is then being analyzed and computed in certain ways in using, in accessible language, something like, statistical algorithms to kind of make inferences. And you can watch then how this is both used as something intuitive and also something game to kind of manipulate, and creating this kind of place that I think is actually helpful, the term discoverability, because it's in this environment or milieu that you're actually trying to make decisions about what content you're interested in. And it's about trying to be attentive to that kind of dynamic processes at work. And I think that that's partially what was interesting about the Facebook case, is that in some ways it emphasizes some more of the kind of traditional aspects of broadcasting, where Facebook was making decisions about what was important. And in some ways, some of the themes of this panel are more subtle, in the sense that content is being recommended in ways that really depend upon your interactions with it and your personalizations. And Chris, you've mentioned some of the data side to it too. I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate a little bit more on what's that link between algorithms and data being generated.
Oh yeah, 100%. Some of the best algorithms learn, and they learn off of measurements that you're putting in. When you choose to click on the second item in a list as opposed to a third item or the first item, you're training it. You all in aggregate train that up in specific types of algorithms, specific types of recommendation systems. Something that's called collaborative filtering. Some of the best algorithms in the Valley actually combine both content filtering and collaborative filtering, and when you put those together, you end up getting a hybrid method. It's said that some companies have a massive advantage because they understand you personally, that when you type in something into a search box at YouTube or at Google, your identity and everything that you've done in the past form a part of that query, and that it will, the reason why they outperform in terms of relevance is because they understand you, and that you're a fundamental part of the overall query. So that's how the two pieces, your behavior and what your intent is at a given moment, and what is available to serve up, all get combined, mashed together into something that's so much more than its individual pieces.
And Daniel, you mentioned that there's an important dimension about the Canadian context as well. In your piece, you were mentioning kind of the relationship of PIPEDA, basically the Public Privacy Act in Canada. I'm blanking on the name. Personal Information and Privacy and Electronic Documents Act. But you mentioned the kind of, I think that's one of the actually interesting tensions, that a lot of this data is being collected and helping algorithms make decisions. And one of the ways that we can understand that link, and part of the kind of interest of why we're here today, is the kind of intersection between algorithms and the kind of regulatory context. And I thought that might be, Daniel, I just was wondering if you're comfortable just talking a little bit more about kind of that link between data and the PIPEDA.
Right, so I'm not an expert on privacy, but what's absolutely clear, and yesterday there was a talk about how the teenager felt about privacy, and they were very concerned about it. but they were okay with a lot of people having access to their information, but they did not want, say, Facebook to know much about them. Which, of course, that they would be very surprised by how much Facebook can tell about them. So we've got this entire industry that's basically following you, whether you like it or not. And what studies show is that they can tell a lot about you. So they can tell your sexual orientation, certainly your gender, your income level, fairly easily. They can tell a lot, and they use this data in ways that are interesting. For example, a recent study showed that if you self-identify online as a woman, you're less likely to receive ads for high-paying jobs. Whereas if you self-identify as man, you're going to be presented with jobs that are, that pay more. Though we don't know exactly why that is, one theory that I have is that possibly men are more likely to click on ads for jobs that pay more, whereas women maybe being, overall being a little bit more cautious, maybe they don't click. And the system learns that, possibly, and then says, oh, you're a woman, we've got this ad for low-paying jobs, here it is. So it's interesting. As far as the privacy goes, yeah, it's a fairly big challenge because, of course, companies like YouTube, Facebook, they don't really abide by our rules, and it's kind of difficult to see how it could all be enforced because they don't actually need to know you by name, right? They just need to know that you're someone, and then they can have all this information, but they don't need to tie it down to your name, which make legal issues much fuzzier.
And that's certainly one of the challenges about using the term privacy in some ways to frame some of these debates and issues, because a lot of the phenomenons are occurring in the aggregate. So it's the ways that we can think in some aspects of PEPITA talking about the kind of data collection and data storage rather than necessarily emphasizing kind of the individual privacy. It's some of these ways that they become aggregated, they become problematic. And I think what's also interesting, and a theme that I'm noticing from a few people, is that the unpleasantness of having some of our behaviors reflected back to us through algorithms and some of the consequences of that. I'm really reminded about Microsoft's recent chatbot, which was on the internet for all of 24 hours before it said a lot of things, which doesn't bear repeating, but I think that you can look at it was certainly targeted by trolls on the internet to say very provocative things, but it also just speaks to how this consequences of the algorithms will reflect the data. And in part, that's not necessarily what we're hoping some of our systems to behave like. In some ways, they are, you talk about the myth of algorithms, but in some ways, we want them to be a better standard because it kind of captures an imaginary that we have that our media can make us better. On this kind of theme of some of the concerns at work, Dylan, you're working on this project. I was wondering if you could, talk any other ways this kind of link between the data and the algorithm is being problematized or problematic.
Well, I mean, just to build off what Daniel was saying, if you're interested in cases of being profiled, there's a case, I think it's LaTanya Sweeney, I think she was a Cornell, she's like a very senior computer scientist at Cornell, I think. Look up LaTanya Sweeney. And she found that compared to her colleagues, she was being delivered a lot of ads for like bail bondsmen and find ways to get your partners or yourself out of jail. And it's just because she had a black sounding name. She is black, and just because of the way her name was spelt, she was being delivered these ads, and it wasn't sort of a self-identification thing. It just her data was pulled based on the cookies that she carried along with her and any kind of identification that she had to put into websites. But look up LaTanya Sweeney because it's a really fascinating case. And so she went in and reverse engineered the algorithm to find out where these racial biases were. And it wasn't someone saying, if black name, then deliver these ads. It's this sort of problematic of the way algorithms are being built, and especially in a machine learning context. A lot of these things are working from correlation rather than causation. So just looking at a bunch of data, you can find weird connections, like 3 days before a tornado hits, Target sells more strawberry Pop-Tarts. This is a correlation, and it's sort of agnostic of someone sitting down and being like, okay, well, people are getting into emergency preparedness kits or whatever. It's just a straight on correlative assumption or correlative result that there is coming out of the statistics. And it's problematic because, at least if it's someone sitting down there writing a formula, you can say, okay, well, why did you put that? You can question a person, but I think there's this sort of agnostic thing of like, oh, it's data. We like there are no biases to data, and correlation is correlation. And all those checks and balances that we have in place for these systems, that if a person was running it, we don't have necessarily for algorithms. So it is foolish to say, oh, it's just a computer doing it, so we have no control, and it is unbiased because there are assumptions baked in.
I think, Dylan, it's so nice because I think it's also important why this panel, I think, is actually quite significant to me as someone who's been kind of interested in this kind of relationship between algorithms and policy, is particularly to kind of emphasize there's particular ways this question will be answered by Canadians. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is the Latanya Sweeting example is that do we have similar issues in Canada? I mean, have research been done to whether First Nations in Canada would have similar amounts of discrimination faced with kind of advertisements online? It'd be really great to duplicate those types of studies and able just to kind of understand some of the consequences that are taking place here that we just, because we're not doing the research or because it's difficult, we don't actually know some of these phenomena. I think that's actually one of the things, when I have the mic for a second, is just emphasizing what's really important about the summit is trying to, again, bring in these really important matters into our existing regulatory discussions. I wanted to kind of just bring it back a little bit to discoverability too, because I think one of the relationships is this question of, between correlation. It's like, if you like, I was joking with a friend, is that mostly what I listen to is Spotify now is kids' music, but at no point does kids' music appear in my discovery playlist. So at some point, the algorithm has figured out that I don't need more recommendations for Sharon Lois and Bram. The question I had was about this question of personalization. In the CMF report, there was a concern about a loss of diversity, and certainly one of the things that the Facebook trending story tells is that Facebook was saying, no, these are the important stories that need to be. These other stories, that's a malfunction in the algorithm. It wasn't necessarily something that we think should be trending. And I'm curious in this moment where we often talk about the relationship between algorithms and filter bubbles. And I was wondering if one of our panelists would be brave enough to kind of introduce this concept of a filter bubble, and then whether we could link it back to some of these ways that filter bubbles might influence how we are exposed to Canadian content.
In the Facebook context, a filter bubble occurs when you curate your social network, when you curate your own graphs and you populate out your feed. And in some more recent studies that were very, very, very good to Facebook, they quantified the differences between liberals and conservatives, and they observed the click path. Are liberals more likely to click on challenging conservative content, or are conservatives more likely to click on challenging liberal content? And they discovered a whole bunch of biases and the way that people actually filtered out the content that they saw based on the social network that they've curated. Now that's a social network. We do the same things with interest networks as well. When we curate Twitter profiles to follow, specific types of algorithms can be far more prone to filter bubbling, where challenging content is deliberately left out, because we enable human beings to actually do it, and that appears to be a natural tendency of some human beings to actually maximize the utility that they're getting for their time in a given digital experience. So that's that would be my crack at the definition of a filter bubble.
Yeah, so I think this definition is basically right. I think recently Facebook announced, I don't have the exact quotes, but that they would try to encourage diversity, because one of the effects that the filter bubble has is that people don't interact with content as much, because this is all stuff you've seen before, and so when you're not challenged anymore, they see that you don't interact with the content, and you sort of let it slide. So this actually causes a problem, and people try to try to get back into the game. So in the early days of the web, in the early days of recommender systems, there was a big hope that the web would, and it was talk about the long tail. I don't know if people remember that we were leaving the era of the blockbusters with TV and so on, where a few key people make all of the decisions. And now we're going to make the decisions, and we're going to, and the small producers would have a chance finally, because they could break through, even though, say, the big agencies don't want them. But that's interesting because of effects like the filter bubbles and so on. Diversity is still not there, and there's studies that show that these effects tend to favor the blockbusters, right? So, for example, just for myself, because of I've decided to design my Twitter feed. I'm getting a lot of buzz from Donald Trump for some reason, and so it's all over, and it's getting on my nerves.
That's
because
he's all over.
Because he's all over, but we don't have this. It's not very different from where we were 30 years ago. We're still stuck in kind of a bubble, except that instead of being decided by the news agency, it's now, it's not algorithms that put us in this spot.
And it's certainly, I think, important to say, just as you say that, is to say that this is a question emerging out of broadcasting, and what we might think of as the traditional complex of attention that was Canadian broadcasting is changing in ways, and that we're thinking of new ways that people are encouraged to pay attention, and the ways those systems are functioning. And I think what's interesting, Daniel, to your point, is trying to, in some ways, getting back to kind of where we can situate algorithms, is that in some ways, if you look at the front page of Netflix, I mean, recently the front page of Netflix is Netflix content takes up 50%. I don't know if you have the similar, who knows whether we have the similar television screen anymore. It's part of the challenge. But 50% of the screen is taken up by Netflix's own. And so you can think about how ownership of platforms and content distribution platforms is able to be influential in ways that are much more tangible as traditional forms of broadcasting. And then secondly, there are these algorithmic recommendations of what appears and what I would like based on my viewing content. And then there's also a lot of the ways the web has changed how we are able to find and interact. And I often think that it's important also to situate as discoverability technologies are things like Reddit and things like Wikipedia, which provide you different pathways of knowledge into which you're able to discover things. And I think that that's important to put them in dialogue in some ways, because you're able to then to say, what does this allow me to discover in terms of content? Getting back to Dylan's comment about the difference between Amazon and Netflix. And then as opposed to how you can spend 3 hours on Wikipedia clicking through and going from what seemed like a very relevant article into a very strange place on the internet. Part of that, I think that question also becomes this question that the CMF report describes as this loss of diversity. And one of the concerns is that if it's only popular content or content that's seemingly going to be popular and thereby likely marketable and kind of will generate clicks is the content that's being recommended. What is the consequence to some of the different ways we've expected media to behave, like recommending important content in terms of the news, or recommending Canadian content in terms of the cultural industries? And so I'm just wondering whether this kind of, convergence, might be one of an algorithmic convergence around kind of one metric about recommendation. And that might be, and I don't mean to, Dylan, I want to make sure you're, but I also just want to say that, have you, these types of filter bubbles, some of the consequences is what is being filtered and for what reason. I was wondering whether in the same way that we might talk about some of the problems about only popular content being filtered, if you've encountered some of these problems of filter bubbles.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to leap into the meat of what I think. We're here, we're talking about algorithms at a CRTC panel. And to me, I can't help but think that like the meat of the conversation for me is if most people are getting their content through algorithmic means, recommendation engines, and we're in this world where Netflix doesn't pay Canadian taxes, it to date has only supported, there's like a co-production, it's a show called Between, which is a co-production between Netflix. It's a Canadian co-production with Netflix and Rogers, and I think the deal of the terms of the deal are that Crave is Rogers, right?
Yeah.
Show me. Then maybe it's not Rogers. But anyway, so I think it's. But
It's Rogers.
oh man, Chorus. Anybody?
There's not that many.
Anyway, so there's one Canadian TV show that that Netflix is putting production funding into, and I have to say, as a Canadian media producer, how I make my money is by previously Canadian content quotas on channels like History or CTV. And if we're shifting into this world where Netflix does not care about Canadian content, which I don't think they do, is there a role for the CRTC to say, hey, listen, here's your algorithm, it recommends these TV shows, I don't know, slap a 30% Canadian content. Well, I mean, like it's, I'm being self-serving here, but I mean, it's up for debate, and I think it needs to be a discussion. But I mean, we were talking earlier, is that even possible? Can you just slap a 30% CanCon filter on an algorithm and still have it work the same way? It may not even be possible.
I mean, the optimization objective of the Netflix algorithm is to minimize churn. It's to minimize subscriber churn and thereby maximize earnings per share. The optimization objective of the Netflix algorithm is not to ensure 30% CanCon, right? And moreover, I'd be very surprised, given the number of countries that Netflix is in and engaged in, that they'd be amenable to actually modifying the algorithm out and down, probably fairly low probability. If the CanCon contributes to Netflix's earnings per share, they're going to put far more. Like it would be 99% CanCon that would be filtered up. So in general, if wouldn't it be nice if we had Canadian companies that had very robust algorithms to promote native Canadian content up. But this is part and parcel a result of the fantastic success of American civilization at being able to push its technology all the way around the world, right? So.
Well, and I would say that's an old, very Canadian question. And I think that's one of the things that, is trying to understand this challenge. And I think that we're here in this room today largely because these were questions we considered long ago. And I think that part of this conversation is adapting to. And I think, Dylan, I think, and it's like, it's like, should we have CanCon algorithms would be a great, title for the panel. But, yeah. But in some ways it raises, I think, it kind of poses the question in a way that I think is functional, because it's like, well, we used to have this system, and that in a way that was attentive to, quotas, I think, were attentive to how media was influential in the sense that there's a schedule, and that you targeted the specific part of the kind of discoverability function of the television schedule into ways that kind of made, that fit cultural policy objectives. And I think that that's one of the challenges and the exciting thing about this summit is that we don't necessarily need to only be kind of responsive, but we also can be proactive in the ways that we think about dealing with these questions of discoverability. And Daniel, I wanted to just say, two things. One, I wanted to get you to respond to this, but two, one of the reasons I was very excited to have Daniel to participate on this panel is that long ago I was familiar with his In Discovery program, which was a project which you can explain a little bit more about, which was a way of trying to develop a collaborative filtering system to recommend Canadian musicians in a way that we could develop a way of Canadian content being discovered. It's one the one I'm familiar with is this kind of early attempt. And Daniel, I just wanted to pass it to you.
Yeah. So at the time, this was 2002. So this was before. This was before YouTube. This was at the time where putting an MP3 file online and having people download it was kind of high tech. And there was this issue that people would not have the bandwidth to get the song. I'm serious. And at the time we thought I was working at the National Research Council, and we thought it would be really, really nice to have all these independent Canadian musicians have a site where they can upload content and have people discover it. And we thought that using interesting algorithms would be one way to do it. So technology is nice. So
We're humans,
so but I'll come back to In Discover. But one thing I wanted to say is, you're right. One problem is that it's hard to check, and you said so. I mean, you have to realize, people sometimes don't realize this, but if you go to Google and you enter some keywords, right, there's absolutely no guarantee that you're going to same answer as I do, right? You have to understand that. And so it's fairly hard to know what, even if the government said, well, to Netflix, people have to watch, 30% Canadian content, how would the government check it, right? I mean, of course, the government could require the company to provide with provide all the user data, but do we actually want the government to be monitoring us at that level? Probably not. So it's hard. But I would say one thing though: we can ask for more transparency, I think. So you were alluding to recommender systems that recommend something, but we don't know why. Amazon as a system, in its book recommender system, it can actually tell you why it's recommending a given book. It says, well, we recommend this book because you bought this other book, right? So there are certain things we can do, and Netflix, I think, is being a little bit extremist because, for example, let's say you wanted, I'm French speaking, and if you want to find French content on Netflix, believe it or not, it's hard. There's no way to know. And if you want to find Canadian content, good luck. Unless you're an industry insider, you won't be able to tell. And clearly, this would be very, very easy for them to implement. And they don't implement it on purpose. Now, going back briefly to In Discover, this eventually died out because in the era of YouTube and so on, there are big players that come in. It makes it very difficult for small teams to compete and control the platform. But I think the idea of is there a role for the government or a big corporation in Canada to play in promoting Kenyan content? I think this is a very important question, and I think that if we leave it up to algorithms, we may not like the result in the end.
Just, I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I just wanted to give everyone a chance to kind of just touch on Daniel's comment about this accountability for algorithms. And I think that that's actually one of the kind of key takeaways to me about this panel is that we do live in very complicated technical systems, and they impact us on an everyday basis. And one of the challenges is that they no longer appear public in the same way that an outrage, we don't witness or experience it all the same way. In fact, what we need to be attentive to is the kind of ways that algorithm is constantly personalizing content. And it's only in kind of comparing and understanding the differences between us that sometimes we may be able to understand the pattern. And so I think that that's one of the important questions about discoverability is one about trying to find ways of kind of renewing democratic oversight over the media system at a time when it is largely or has a close relationship with kind of algorithmic personalization, data-driven systems, and largely globalized players. I'm very fond of this interview with a member of OkCupid, who is an online dating site, describing that if you use the site, you're being experimented on. And I think one of the challenges of Canadians is that we are part of a global experiment. And we have where at universities we have an ethics review board. There's no ethics review board for some of the global experiments we know take place on the web. And I'm wondering if our panelists just might be able to talk through and just in different ways and facets about this kind of relationship between algorithms and accountabilities. Dylan, I know you have been thinking about that. I wonder if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the main things that in my research I'm trying to figure out, I've been posing this question to a lot of people. Here are algorithms, algorithms are used for parole hearings in Pennsylvania. They're used for predictive policing. These have major impacts on our lives, and how do we come to terms with them? There are a bunch of different layers. I've forwarded the panel. There's a really good article by Andrew Turcotte, an FDA for algorithms, that says, maybe there should be government rules around transparency. And I think transparency is the most important step that we can take right now to make sure that we're disclosing what exactly we're doing. I mean, the VW emissions test. The reason why that algorithm snuck by everyone is because it was held under intellectual property rights. This is our intellectual property. This is our algorithm that helps us run our engine. So you can't touch it. But maybe we need to have better oversight. I think we need to just start demanding transparency. And then also on our side in the media, we need to develop better algorithmic literacy.
Chris, did you want
to? Transparency is really, really great because it's the more trust you have with the algorithm, with the utility, the better it can be, and the more incremental aspects of yourself you may be willing to share with it. And that all comes down to the trustability of the brand and the trustability of the company. There's a slight dark side on the transparency front. There was this great golden age for text analytics and search, and there were basically you could go into a typical piece of web analytics software. You could extract all the keywords that people were using in order to find your content. You could do scoring. Just a very, very, very beautiful piece of innovation, a beautiful era of science during those years. Google had several angry meetings about how they were making people way smarter. They were making webmasters way smarter. They were making the SEOs way smarter. And they ended up clamping back on it. We actually have less data today about how people use Google and how it interacts with your own media site than we did before. It was because some people were attempting to manipulate the search rankings in an effort to bend them to their own will. And Google regards that as being a form of spamming. Whenever you're overriding the relevance of the engine, you are in many ways actually harming Google's revenue base. And if there's anything that Google is very passionate about, it's defending their revenue base and their profit share. So long as the data, I'm all for transparency, so long as the negative effects, so long as the commons don't get completely destroyed and ruined. But by and large, the individual should be massively empowered to be able to understand how their information is used. And that's just really, really great design.
Yeah, I think we would need, I mean, the panel cannot do this job now, but we need to define transparency, because even if you had access to YouTube's source code, I mean, all of it, right? I dump all of it on your hard drive, and I say, you know.
But I mean, the flip side of that is, we have to improve our literacy. But one of the ways Nick Diakopoulos talks a lot about this, of like, you know what, even if we can't understand every line of code, and maybe lines of code don't matter in an age of machine learning. At least we could say we know what inputs are being put in and we know what's coming out, and we can measure those things. And so those are useful, stakes in the ground that we can orient ourselves around.
I mean, and yeah, I think that, there's lots of I think ways to be attentive, and I think, Chris, your point about like search engine optimization, I think is really, really important, because, and it's one also I think that we should be aware of that's already going on, like clickbait and going viral, I think are actually examples of people who are like the next generation of search engine optimization. I mean, sure, that they talk about it that way. But I mean, in a certain sense that there are new affordances and new ways that knowledge is being concentrated. And that means that certain people are experts at gaming and manipulating algorithmic systems. And so I think there's a tension between trying to understand this knowledge exists and how do we, in ways, publicize aspects of it that encourage kind of cultural and policy objectives that we've set forth, and whether that's in the Broadcasting Act or in a future, in future policy. And I think there's also kind of really legitimate concerns that are taking place in Canada right now. Certainly one of the things that the Trans-Pacific Partnership has issues about the disclosure of source code, and so this might put us in a more precarious situation where it would be more difficult as a result to be able to find some of these systems accountable, even if we were able to in the first place. And I think one of the things, and this is something that Nick and other people have talked about, is kind of this emphasis on kind of studying running code. And one of the ways that I get into, actually it's the inverse, one of the reasons I get into internet measurement and kind of concerns about how do we study the operation of the internet was in some ways of trying to develop mechanisms of accountability of kind of complex technical systems. And so one of the things I think, because I'd like to transition to questions, but one of the things just to say that's important is that I'd really encourage, and maybe I'll tweet out the link to Nick's work, and ProPublica, which is an organization in the States, has been really interesting in reverse engineering how Obama would write messages to different demographics. And I think there are really tangible ways that we can start bringing more accountability to algorithms, and one of the things that could be easily done is start potentially reverse engineering ways, not reverse engineering, but studying and being attentive to the ways that content is being recommended in different systems. And that's, I think, important research to be done and be attentive to. But we have about 15 minutes, or we have about 10 minutes for questions. And I just wanted to make sure that if you all are here on a beautiful sunny day at 9 o'clock in the morning, that you also have a chance to ask some questions to our very, very knowledgeable panelists. So we have a hand up there. How do I do this? Yeah, you were the quickest. You were quick. You won the Jeopardy round.
So for those people in the room that are maybe content creators, content owners, content distributors, do you guys... we're recording this. Okay. Hi, guys. For those in the room that are content creators, content owners, content distributors, do you guys have any tips and tricks that we can use to make sure that our content shows up in those algorithms, like the Facebooks, the YouTubes, the Netflix, other than spam was already mentioned, so that could be good. And anyone who's following discoverability as a hashtag on Twitter, I'm sure has seen some of that spam and how that can work, or clickbait. I mean, is there any sort of better hands-on tips from anyone?
Oh, I've got no suggestions.
RTFM, with respect, that means read the fracking manual. Google is very, very explicit in how to format your meta tags for it to be crawled. Incredibly explicit, in fact. And there's quite the little industry that we have here in Canada with people that go around and repeat what's in that document. By and large, yeah, that was a nice shot, right? By and large, the way that I like to think of it is if you are writing really, really relevant content, most engines are incented to sort that content and put it in front of the most relevant audiences because the incentives typically, with certain exceptions recently in the press, typically the incentives are very much aligned. So if you focus more on making human-readable content as opposed to massive amounts of energy trying to game the system, I think that you'll find a higher overall sustainable competitive advantage in pursuit of that policy.
Yesterday they were talking about the workshops they did with the teenagers a couple of days ago, and one of the workshop, and I don't mean to say that content creators are teenagers, but they had a workshop on teaching kids to control their brand, right? And they basically were telling them, well, create a site or blog or whatever and have all your activities linked back to it, right? And obviously, the lead in question was thinking probably of PageRank, which may or may not be actually used, but the idea is that if you link at something a lot, it's going to rank higher. I've been teaching college students about blogging for some time as a computer science prof. And one thing that I found was very interesting is a lot of people, they don't actually have any strategy about their own brand, right, online. When they do something, they do post it, but they never think about, they don't like, a lot of people, even people who are who try to break into some industry, they often don't like marketing, or they only want to market their product but not themselves. And I see that as a problem because online you have to be someone. You have to take control of your brand, I think.
And then I have nothing to add. I just wonder, I was talking to someone who does social media for Vice last week, and we were talking about where is your best money and time spent? And she was just like, you know what? Buying promoted Facebook ads and buying promoted Twitter ads. I think we're sort of reaching the end of organic viral explosions. I think you have to be, and this is what Facebook and Twitter have been, scheming for the last decade of like finding ways to monetize their products, and how to do that is through promoted tweets, because we're at the end of, I think, maybe I'm wrong, of just organic breakouts.
Well, and certainly I think that plays to a link about this, like advertising typically was, again, something on the schedule, and now we might see that these platforms finally figure out, because it wasn't clear initially how advertising was going to work in early radio. And so certainly this might be an example that these platforms finally figure out that they're actually exceptionally more influential, and as a result of that know how then to better monetize their influence. One of the things I would just also say that is one of my kind of other comments I want to make is that there's also been a lot of talk about some of the difficulty and the precarity of being a producer on online platforms. And certainly there's been recent criticisms about how it's very difficult to actually be sustainable on YouTube, for example. I think that that's one of the themes, is that it's not about discoverability, but about actually creating sustainable jobs. And so one of the things to say is that given, I think, the difficulties about being a successful content producer in some of these platforms, I think there are opportunities to create new platforms. And I've been very attentive to what's going on in the States about this idea of platform cooperativism, which is kind of trying to create more horizontal affinities between content producers and creating platforms that work for them. And I think that that's one of the other responses too, is that this might be an opportunity where Canadians start taking seriously that idea of platform cooperativism as a kind of future of public media and as a future of ways of addressing some of these issues that you're going to be increasingly on platforms that might be very disinterested in making you successful unless you're willing to pay for it. We have another, well, how'd it go?
Hi.
And then we'll make sure we'll have one more question.
Drew Robinson, Chorus Entertainment. So one of the, content is, we've been talking a lot about Facebook and things like that and products. And, when you're talking about recommending a blender and because you have another blender, it's a little bit, I think in my mind, easier and clear cut, but content is hard to define. And so when, I might define something as a drama series, you might define it as a comedy. And when you put that into an algorithm, I guess there's two sides in terms of who controls and defines that content. The algorithm's only as good as these meta tags you're referring to. So in this new world, can you give examples of maybe how content producers, owners have maintained or kept some of that control, and whether or not that is playing a big part, whether it's Netflix or in other platforms?
Well, okay. So I think there was when the web was emerging, a lot of people spent a lot of time on taxonomies and on manually categorizing things, and this did not scale very well. And the Facebook issue, where they pay people to decide what's important. Part of the problem with that also is that it does not scale very well. So the reason why we use machine learning is that it's only this way that we can actually provide personalized content to millions of people without paying millions of dollars. So I'm not sure how much necessarily. For example, Google is I'm not sure how much weight Google puts on manually tagging things. It's probably not less than people might think.
I think that there are so many additional applications of really, really rich tagging, of a really, really rich taxonomy. So just a for instance, once I wanted to characterize an audience that was interested in AHL hockey and Atlantic local hockey. In order to build that taxonomy, I had to actually search long and hard for a list of the name of every single player and the name of every single coach and put it in, and it was incredibly painful. Yesterday, it was mentioned that some companies should have a VP of taxonomy to make sure that the pipeline is actually properly populated with the metadata. There are so many really good additional uses for the metadata for machines on the content side. From an IR, from an information retrieval perspective, from a Google perspective, likely less so. But from a Canadian media, from an owned content perspective, significantly more so. And I understand it's a major pain point, and I understand that I'm rather demanding when I expect a content producer who spent all this amazing amount of time, labor-intensive to get it all the way up to the 1 yard line, and ask them to invest the incremental effort to put in rich metadata and tagging. It's yet one more thing on their plate, which is why I think that machine learning and there's no brakes on the AI hype train. It would be nice if we got some help from our machine friends, for sure. Make it more robust.
Okay, and we have two more questions, and I just wanted to say we have 10 minutes left, so I see three hands now. Yeah, but I also just want to say there's also an interesting question about Upworthy. In particular, I have a graduate student who's studying Upworthy, and particularly they're talking about a turn towards attention minutes. It's a different way of valuing, what is measurable and what informs kind of an algorithmic system of recommendation. One of the things that could be a potential outcome of this summit is whether there was actually a greater kind of Canadian consultation on what would be tangible analytics. So is it like that there's a national standard for attention minutes, or what are the certain ways that that broadcasters and content producers might be able to agree on common standards for metrics, and so that we can have some sort of common system, and that might then potentially inform how these algorithms work. So 1, 2, 3, and I'm just telling my panelists we have about 10 minutes. So I might not make sure everybody answers it, but we'll make sure that we answer all these questions. So apologies, for the time.
No problem. My name is Solange Drouin. I represent the independent record producers in Quebec. And so I'm in the music industry, so we've been dealing with that kind of issues for many years. And we all know, so I would like to congratulate the CRTC to have that kind of panel, because I guess it's a key panel in this discoverability summit. So we all know for now in the music industry that it's not sufficient to be good, that to be found, to be heard. So it's important that we are put forward, and we all know that we had quotas in the Canadian industry, radio industry, and it created a vibrant industry, Canadian industry. So it's important that we have that in mind, for the future, because it was not a minus, it was a plus to have that kind of rules, because we can tell in the music industry that the long tail is now the long fail. It's a long fail. It doesn't work. You have to be put forward. So it's important. I don't buy the argument that if we put in place a Canadian music platform, it will solve all the problem. We don't buy it. In Quebec, we don't buy it. I know that my friend in the music industry in the rest of Canada are of the same opinion. So it's important that we are on all platforms, even foreign platforms. So what I hear from you is that it's not a question of there's no technological problem to make sure that all these platforms could put our Canadian content forward. It could be done. So for me, that is the question. After that, we have to ask ourselves, how do we do that? How the CRTC could do that kind of regulation? Because we all know that if we leave it to the Netflix and Spotify and Pandora of the earth, they won't do it. They won't do it because they have no incentive to do so. So I would like to hear it very clearly from you, the expert, that would it be possible for Netflix in terms of technology or Spotify or to have put in place in their algorithm some tagging referring to the origin of the content, and the CRTC, let's say, could ask each platform to put every X frequency put forward for the Canadian public. I mean the Canadian public, not all the public of the earth. Canadian public put forward that content if it's embedded in their algorithm and if it's tagged properly.
Just because I wanted to take the last two. I just wanted to, if it's with all due respect, I just wanted to take sure we took the last two questions, and then we'll respond to all three because we're running short on time. And then we have this gentleman in the front. So just state the question.
Thank you, Daniel. My question is sort of a statement that connects to a lot of others. I've just returned from Singularity University, which is on the Google campus, where I've been exposed to all the world's leading technologies and where they're going. And I've been trying to relate this to our Canadian media problems, and I think, or our challenges. And I think one of the issues is that while there are 3 billion people online right now, there are up to 5 billion more coming on by 2020. And it seems to me that there is no algorithm that can make people want to watch anything, and that, going back to the attention statement, isn't it true that one of the keys to our system is to adjust it so that we create content that up to 1 billion people want to watch? And winning, so to speak, will solve all those problems.
And the last question here in the front.
Well, as I watch this conference, it strikes me that technological forces perhaps are changing the role of government less from regulation into more of facilitation. So you've commented that, at least in terms of algorithms, regulation is rather difficult. I wonder if you could comment on facilitation and the role of government taking that approach.
Okay. And last comments from our in response, who would like to?
I'm just going to weigh in on the CMF report. They said there's no magic algorithm to make Canadians like Canadian content, which I thought was that's some harsh shade. But I also think that one of the things that, I don't know, I think we talk about content as though, American content is better for whatever reason. And I think we're just sort of ignoring this question that, taste is subjective. Like, taste is a social construct as well. There are a lot of great Canadian breakout hits, like Kenny versus Spenny. That's not on any American radar. That would kind of came out of nowhere. Or like Degrassi, like that whole chain. Especially in the first couple of iterations, like I don't think we can construct that. And I think, I don't know. I just think that there needs to be. I think the CRTC needs to have some more consultations to see about what values that we want to preserve. Maybe we don't want to preserve Canadian content, but not from this position of the American product is better. Maybe it's more diversification of content. I mean, or Letterkenny is another good example of something that's been a huge hit. That's sort of weird and left field and can travel in strange ways. I think it's a more nuanced conversation and a little bit more messy, which maybe we should embrace.
Daniel?
I wanted to comment on the issue of regulation. In the software industry, what we do is we do a lot of testing, right? So half of the time we spend developing software is spent in testing. And testing does not require you to have access to the source code. It doesn't even require for the people to be willing participant. So a famous case was during the browser wars. Microsoft claimed that Internet Explorer could not be split off from Windows because it was tightly embedded, and an independent tester proved them wrong. And certainly it would be possible for I'm not saying the CRTC should do it, but the CRTC could test Netflix and see what happens when you have a given you're a given customer with a given profile. What is the result? And you can be almost sure that there's a lot of testing going on in Netflix, and they do that kind of stuff. They say, well, what if I'm this type of user? What happens, right? And certainly a regulation agency could come in and could test these systems. They could try to see what happens without necessarily spying on us and without having access to the source code of the company. So I'm just saying that regulations has to take a different form, but it does not need to be impossible.
To touch directly on that point about 5 billion Canadians coming on.
No, not 5 billion.
Or not Canadians. Hopefully 5 billion Canadians. We got a very, very, very big country. We got a very, very big country, that, for the past 450, 500 years, we've been trying to fill up. And, unlike Britain, which got full a long time ago and began exporting its culture out, what is so exciting about the globalization of these platforms and these algorithms is that Canadians can actually compete and actually have an equal opportunity to compete. So being in that mindset, accelerating the way that we build content, the way that we measure how that content is performing on those international platforms, and then learning from it, actually actively incorporating those lessons back in, could actually open up and expand the pie way bigger. So I suppose I view it less as being from a protectionist perspective to being more like how can we collaborate with government, get the right policy mix in there that enables us to kind of overcome some of our natural geographical challenges that we have in this country, and be able to go out and really, really kick some A.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, just to conclude, I just wanted to say that one of the things I hope you've taken away from this panel is that that we think of algorithms as having a focused role in a larger question of discoverability. And I think hopefully you've seen some of the connections. The second point I just wanted to say is that there's also an important way and role for regulatory oversight. And that I certainly think that one of the challenges that we're faced with a lot of, increasingly global companies, how do we have democratic transparency in Canada? And I think that as Canadian citizens, that's one of the levels we might play over, is that globalization is taking place, but these questions of democracy haven't been solved globally, and so are continuing to have to be solved locally. And then finally, I think this is also important to remember. In the past, the CBC has experimented with new distribution techniques like BitTorrent, and I think this is a real reminder that for public media in Canada to embrace being experimental and thinking through the ways it's historically been experimental and the ways in the future it can be experimental to these new audiences and platforms and opportunities. Mm-hmm. So with that, I'd like to thank my panelists for this fantastic panel. And thank everyone for their questions, and again, have a great day.